Alfred Hawksworth hurried along the dusty road in his carriage toward the village of Oak Ridge, situated 30 miles east of the military town of Greenwood. The writer made a point to avoid many settlements in order to collect a rich tapestry of local tales, legends, and even light-hearted anecdotes about past lives, eagerly shared by the residents of Ashford County. To encourage more open and friendly conversations, Alfred brought along a couple of bottles of strong mead, acquired from sailors on the sandy coast, originating from the distant southern land of Andalusia. In the most recent hamlet, locals spoke of an intriguing one-armed old man residing closer to the mountain range to the east. They described him as a former soldier who had lost his arm either in battle or during his time as a guard. Captivated by this character, Alfred speculated that he might possess memories of military service worth capturing. As the horizon expanded, rural lands unfolded with expansive fields and unremarkable orchards dotted with low trees. The rocky soil here seemed unlikely to yield abundant harvests. Approaching closer, the traveler noticed diligent peasants contending with a surge of weeds, which had thrived in this year's warmth. "Good folk," he called out to the peasants. The laborers paused and straightened their backs, exchanging curious glances. A middle-aged, robust, sun-bronzed man with a cloth wrapped around his head, presumably the head of the household, approached Alfred. "Greetings," he said gruffly to Alfred. "Lost your way? Or searching for someone?" "Indeed, I am seeking someone. In the village westward, they mentioned an old one-armed soldier residing in your settlement. Am I in the right place?" The villager glanced back at his astonished kin, scratching his beard. "You must be looking for Werner. We do have a one-armed man here, although he's not originally from around here. We've lived here all our lives, but he came here about 10 years ago. A peculiar man, keeps to himself, quite skittish. Built himself a house and lives there alone. But why do you seek him?" "I am a writer, traveling to gather stories," Alfred explained, showing his thick notebook bound in rough leather. "I hope to talk with him, to learn about his life." "You've come to the right place, then. We have plenty of stories to share, and there are no better storytellers than our own." Alfred had heard such claims countless times before. Every storyteller believed they were the best. Yet, the stories often resembled one another, particularly when told by someone who had enjoyed a bit too much of their own supply. Alfred looked over to the field where the rest of the family stood, waiting for the head signal. "The sun is still high. I wouldn't want to distract you from your work or impose on you. Perhaps we could talk closer to sunset." The peasant scratched his bearded chin thoughtfully. "That's true indeed. There's work to be done while the sun shines. Come after sunset. But for now, go down that road," he said, pointing towards the path ahead. "He lives in a cabin by the stream. His field is just nearby. After you've had your talk, you can come back here for lodging." "Thank you for your assistance, kind sir," Alfred responded, nodding appreciatively. The host nodded back. Alfred climbed into his carriage and directed Care to proceed toward the stream as instructed. As they traveled through the village, despite the apparent toil reflected in the villagers' labor, the expansive fields bordered by wild grasses and shrubs, and the modest homes nestled into the landscape, there was an overarching sense of peace that calmed Alfred. Although he had never worked the land, he often fantasized about a simpler life as a peasant. Villagers paused to watch the carriage pass, their expressions curious, while children drew near, eager for a glimpse of the intriguing visitor, likely imagining his life as being as fascinating as he found theirs. In about 15 minutes, they reached the stream. Along its banks downstream stretched a small field, where a quaint house, embraced warmly by the earth on all sides, stood as a testament to its owner's diligent care. Alfred alighted from the carriage and took in the sight of the land. The field was modest, but the perfectly straight rows of potatoes and the virtual absence of weeds spoke of meticulous care and hard work devoted to the coming harvest. The owner, focused on his task, was managing his hoe with skilled ease despite his missing arm. "Mr. Werner?" Alfred called out. The old man jerked around, his grip on the hoe tightening as if it were a weapon. "Who are you, and what brings you here?" he demanded with a sharp tone. He appeared to be in his 70s, his face marked deeply by the sun and hard labor, yet his posture was vigorous, and the remnants of military discipline were evident in his stance. "I'm Alfred Hawksworth, a writer," Alfred introduced himself calmly, resting his hands on the fence that bordered the field. "I come from Rivendell, traveling to collect stories, and I was directed here because of your reputed history. Could you share some of your tales with me?" The old man surveyed Alfred with a wary eye, his gaze drifting over the carriage and the surrounding hills, as if half expecting others to emerge. After a moment, he stepped cautiously between the rows of potatoes, still visibly guarded. "A writer, huh? You've traveled quite a distance for your craft. What have they told you about me that brought you to my doorstep?" In the village of Elmbrook to the west, they had spoken of a seasoned soldier, hardened by battles. "I wanted to learn about your experiences in the wars between the noble lords, about your life after the battles, your campaigns," Alfred explained. The old man leaned his hoe on his shoulder and wiped the dust from his eyes, pondering his response. "Much has unfolded in the broader world and in the brutal conflicts of war. But tell me, Mr. Alfred, did you encounter anyone on your journey here?" Werner inquired, his eyes briefly scanning the distant hills, hinting at a restless past. Alfred followed his gaze before responding. "I came across a shepherd with his flock downstream. Nothing more. Don't fret over it. Old age tends to cloud the mind. Now," he gestured toward the opening in the hedge that served as a gate, "since you've graced me with your visit, it's only right I offer you my hospitality. Please come inside and bring your servant along." Werner slung the hoe over his shoulder and led the way to his house. Alfred signaled to Care to follow and, out of habit, brought along a bottle of mead just in case. They entered the modest cabin, ducking slightly to avoid the low ceiling. Inside, Werner directed them to a small table. Care took a seat on a chest against the wall, while Werner offered Alfred a roughly hewn wooden chair. "It's been a while since I've had company. Tell me, how fares Rivendell, the capital? Has it changed much over the years?" After the feudal lords were expelled and the king was captured, the people began to act out, overwhelmed by their newfound freedom. "I remember those times," Werner interjected. "The folks here also yearned to act out, but they never got the chance. They were kept in line with an iron fist. Many rebellions flared up elsewhere. After the war, rebels preached autonomy, but any anarchistic movements were quickly subdued. Now, with the dust settling, trade has begun to flourish again. The guilds have expanded their influence, and now guildmasters from the capital control all commerce within the province. Haven't the printer's news reached you out here? I live quite secluded, as you see. The local rumor mill brands me as an oddity, and that keeps others at a distance." The old man coughed lightly. "Forgive me if I sound a bit gruff. You seem like a man who's witnessed much. You've engaged with scholars, visited the capital, fought in battles, and challenged nobles under the banner of a new era. I'd be honored to learn more about your life and, with your permission, to immortalize your stories in a book. There's no harm in that. Writers have always played a vital role. But what is that you have there?" Werner's eyes caught the glint of the bottle in Care's hand. "Some Andalusian mead, Mr. Werner. I find it makes for good conversation." "You're quite the pleasant talker," the old man said with a newfound warmth. Werner got up to set the table while Care placed the bottle down and helped the host. As they prepared the table, Alfred had the opportunity to observe Werner's home more closely. The cabin was furnished in a simple martial style. A cot draped with a woolen blanket and a sack for a pillow, above which hung a battle saber, its scabbard gathering dust. A solitary table with 2 handcrafted chairs, a chest against the wall, and a small cupboard for pottery completed the scene. Soon, Werner and Care had laid out 3 clay cups and 3 wooden bowls on the table, alongside a large bowl filled with smoked fish and fresh vegetables. The old man smiled and served Alfred some snacks, while Care had already begun pouring the mead. Out of respect for their host, they all emptied their cups in a single gulp, but Alfred continued to sip cautiously, intent on keeping a clear head for when Werner delved into more engaging topics. However, the former soldier was more focused on current affairs, probing into the changes in Rivendell since the advent of the new collective government, the treatment of craftsmen and merchants, and he showed a particular interest in religious matters, specifically about whether various destructive and corrupt cults were being actively suppressed. "There was an incident," Alfred began, a somber tone in his voice, "one I would rather not have witnessed. At that time, I wasn't yet a writer. I was employed by the Printers Guild and had been sent south to gather information on the state of the city of Brit, where a faction of noble rebels had been quelled. Upon my arrival, I immediately went to the guard's headquarters to meet with the captain and to understand the full situation. However, he was nowhere to be found, and the local clerks outright refused to disclose any details or tell me when I could begin my assignment, as the article needed to be published urgently. Frustrated by my inability to locate the captain and realizing that he wouldn't be available until nightfall, I retired to an inn where I rented a room. I had just settled with a book by the open window when a woman's anguished scream pierced the air. Startled and fearing a resurgence of rebel attacks, I hurried out into the street. I passed several women, likely traders, and further up, a crowd had gathered. 4 guards were attempting to disperse the onlookers with shouts and blows, but they couldn't prevent me from seeing the cause of the commotion. A young woman lay motionless in the street mud, her body arranged in a grotesque tableau. She was on her back, her arms outstretched, her legs twisted unnaturally beneath her, hidden by her torn dress, from which her bruised organs protruded, soaked in blood from her split abdomen. I witnessed her final convulsions and her last gasping breath, after which her expression of intense agony finally relaxed into stillness. Beside her, 2 guards struggled to restrain a burly man dressed in black loose clothing, who kept breaking free from their grasp, shouting incoherently. Fearing that this madman was casting a spell, one of the guards, momentarily stepping back from crowd control, tried to subdue the assailant with a heavy blow from his baton. Although the man's rambling was interrupted, he only quieted down after receiving 3 forceful blows. Despite strong resistance from the incensed townspeople, the lawmen managed to escort the murderer to the dungeon, and I spent the rest of the day alone in my room, calming my nerves with the help of mead. You may mock my frailty and indulgence, but until that moment, I had never witnessed such a sudden and violent death. The old man shook his head solemnly and poured himself another drink. The first sight of blood is always difficult, especially for a sensitive soul like yours. You are remarkably open. I am impressed. And I will continue. The next day, I returned to the guard's headquarters because my assignment was still pending, and I finally met Captain Enroth. He received me with displeasure. I won't tire you with the details of our disagreement, but the main takeaway from our conversation was that the murderer was not a lone madman, but a member of a group of fanatics who had taken refuge in the forests around the city. This group's actions had already led to the disappearance of 4 hunters, but the investigation only began in earnest after they desecrated graves in the local cemetery. Believing these actions to be guerrilla tactics by feudal rebel insurgents, I was then sent to the city of Brit. You see, these fanatics were not only kidnapping people and desecrating graves, but they were also tormenting the living. I admit I was terrified. Alfred finished speaking. Even though we're merely sitting at this table, we've already delved into some dark topics. You've been open with me, and it's only fair I reciprocate. Let me share a story from my past. Perhaps it will help steer your thoughts for your book. He downed another shot of the bitter drink, this time without any accompanying snacks, and glanced out the window, his eyes sweeping over the distant hills. After a grueling campaign under the banner of freedom, I returned to Rivendell with my regiment, where I was honorably discharged. The ideals we fought for had triumphed, and it was crucial to maintain their implementation and the order during peacetime. My comrade in arms, Angus, and I decided to join the city guard. What better is there for a soldier fresh from the campaign, while his hands are still warm? Besides, it promised housing and sustenance. We were stationed in the town of Silverholm, about 300 miles east of Rivendell, in a remote, wild area. The locals, mainly hunters, were peaceful, familiar with each other, concerned mostly with hunting and the upcoming timber harvesting plans. Despite being a backwater, the community was tranquil, too busy with their lives to cause much trouble, though thievery thrived due to the fur trade. Occasionally, strange reports of people going missing and horrific discoveries would reach us from Rivendell, sometimes involving desecrated graves, but it was often dismissed as the work of marauders. Despite rumors of various witch covens that parents used to frighten their children, we believed these were just remnants of a bygone era. In this new age, we were convinced that one should not depend on malevolent gods but rely on one's own strength. However, we had to intervene when a woodcutter, who had vanished for several days after a hunting trip, returned to town screaming for help, his body covered with savage wounds. We brought him to the infirmary, but neither we nor the doctor could make any sense of his ravings. He fought us off, screaming that he was dying and that we would all perish miserably. It was a disturbing incident, but the doctor insisted the man had likely been attacked by a wild animal, perhaps a wolf or bear, and that fear had deranged him. Nonetheless, we restrained him and sent him off to Rivendell for further care. About a month later, we received alarming news from a group of hunters who had been living in a cabin deep in the forest. They came to us fully armed and visibly shaken. Their story made us question our earlier assumptions about the woodcutter. They told us that upon returning from a hunt that lasted over a day, they discovered a scene of gruesome carnage in their cabin. The body of a man, horrifically mutilated and torn apart, lay amidst the wreckage. The seasoned hunters suspected a deranged beast at first, but no animal tracks were found. Only human footprints, and multiple sets at that. The leader of the hunters suggested that occultists might be behind this atrocity. Armed to the teeth, we went to inspect the site. What we found in the hunting cabin confirmed our worst fears and, in our eyes, justified the hunters' terror. The cabin was in shambles, hunting gear strewn everywhere, the heavy table and bunk beds overturned and smashed, window shutters broken from the outside as if frenzied beasts had tried to break in from every direction. From beneath the overturned furniture and scattered personal belongings, the remains of a human body protruded, or rather, it was a ghastly mess of bones and flesh. The visible upper torso consisted of exposed, shattered ribs beneath which vital organs were conspicuously absent. Remnants of bloody tissue were strewn about the single-room cabin. The head and one arm were missing, leaving behind only the blood-soaked remnants of the arm's bone, with the hand also gone. After mastering our initial horror and panic, we managed to compose ourselves and cautiously inspected the scene. Removing more debris, we found the lower part of the body similarly mutilated. The legs were reduced to bloodied bones, almost entirely stripped of flesh. The leader of the hunters noted that the marks on the thigh bones were unmistakably from human teeth mixed with the bites of some unidentified creature. Stepping outside for fresh air, I saw the surrounding hunters and guards, all visibly shaken by horror and disgust. To steady my nerves, I examined the tracks in the soft earth, joined soon by my companions. A quick assessment confirmed that no fewer than a dozen attackers had approached from the south, from the direction of the swamps. A revelation that surprised us, as the hunters insisted there was scant wildlife there, and the area was largely unexplored. The fact that the attackers were barefoot was equally disturbing, as it was unthinkable for anyone to traverse the forest without shoes, even in warm weather. It was clear. A cult had established itself near Silverholm. That evening, we dispatched a message to Rivendell requesting that a squad of holy paladin knights be sent to us. We recalled all hunters from their duties, and a curfew was imposed, forbidding residents from leaving their homes after dark. Nonetheless, not everyone heeded the warning with fear. By the next morning, a group of local peasants and craftsmen had gathered at our post, offering their assistance in rooting out the fanatics. Their concern for their families was palpable, and they were eager to protect them. While we could not permit these civilians to join the fight, their vigilance proved invaluable in securing the town. Each patrolled the streets after sunset, ensuring that every corner was watched. Reinforcements from Rivendell arrived on the third day. We immediately began strategizing our search for the cult's lair. The arriving magister elaborated on their origins, habits, and the most effective tactics for confronting or eliminating such occultists. The local hunters suggested several potential hiding spots, focusing particularly on caves. It was noted that just beyond the large swamp to the south lay a small cave, from which a spring once flowed. As the commanders were finalizing our plans, a young boy rushed up, reporting that the master tanner had not shown up for work and his home was found in disarray. His entire family had vanished overnight. We could not delay, and the detachment from Rivendell set out with us leading the way. The swamp was desolate, yet we pressed on, circling southwest through dense forests not yet touched by loggers. The wilderness was uninviting, making progress difficult in our heavy armor and with swords at our sides. But as we neared the swampy areas, the forest opened up, becoming more spacious and brighter. Suddenly we began to hear eerie rhythmic sounds and sharp cries, as if a multitude of frightened birds were taking flight. For the first time since the battles of the war, an oppressive sense of horror engulfed me as we approached our unknown destination. I tried to convince myself that the rumbling and shrieking we heard were merely the sounds of screaming frogs and their predators, abundant in this region. Navigating around the swamp, we reached a slight elevation, a wooded hill that abruptly ended in a mire. Here, the oppressive swamps released the intoxicating stench of decaying plants. From our vantage point, we could see a rocky crevice spoken of by the locals, but our attention was drawn elsewhere. On a small, sun-dried patch of marshland, a 3-meter-high pile of yellowish stones loomed, encircled by crudely carved wooden spikes. Impaled on these spikes were the tormented bodies of villagers abducted the night before. At the base of this horrific monument, logs were stacked into a large bonfire, where the unmistakable remains of human corpses, blackened ribs and skulls, crackled and burned, licked by bright flames. Around this monstrous altar, figures darted and emitted piercing cries while several sat at a distance, pounding drums in a mad rhythm that accompanied the frenzied movements of the sectarians. Our squad remained hidden behind the trees on the hillside, unnoticed by the ecstatic heretics. Angus and I took cover behind the nearest boulder to minimize our visibility. Meanwhile, the paladin warriors silently unsheathed their blades and prepared compact crossbows, their bolts coated with paralyzing venom. I drew my sword, followed by Angus. Poised for the assault, we watched the terrifying spectacle of the deranged hermits, who danced around the blazing altar to the rhythmic beat of the drums, their cries synchronizing with the pulsing rhythm. Suddenly, the drums crescendoed and halted abruptly. The chaotic movement ceased. The entire crowd fell to their knees, bowing before the stone altar, atop which we now saw lay a tortured, lifeless body. In unison, the fanatics began chanting a rhythmic incantation, their words forming a macabre prayer. "King, King, our King, King Corpse, King Werewolf." At their invocation, as if summoned from the earth itself, a creature climbed onto the stone pile. It bore humanoid proportions but was grotesquely altered. Once perhaps human, its current form was indistinguishable. Naked, immensely muscular, and partially covered with fur, its gender was unrecognizable. Its chest was shielded by bony armor, long claws extended from its hands, and a wolf-like face snarled beneath a crown made of human bones. Approaching the corpse on the altar, the creature placed its paws on it, sinking its claws deep. Its head began to sway slowly, and the kneeling devotees around the altar mirrored its movements, chanting an incomprehensible polyphonic hymn, as if controlled by the grotesque werewolf, swaying them in its gruesome rhythm. The thick, guttural sounds from the blasphemous acolytes worshipping the beast seemed to flood my senses like murky water, dragging me toward a trance. A sweet yet musty scent of earth mixed with rotting flesh filled my nostrils, compelling me to shut my eyes and ears, attempting to shut out the influence of this hypnotic chorus. My mind whirled with confusion, visions of disturbed soil teeming with hordes of slimy grave worms and insects with hard carapaces flashing before my eyes. White threads of mycelium burst forth from decaying trees, and twisted white flowers bloomed atop dead wood. These images seemed to burrow deep into my very being, as if creeping beneath my skin, attempting to root themselves in my heart. However, a human cry pierced through the fog, a desperate clarion call that snapped me back to reality like a gulp of cold water. I opened my eyes just as the twang of a crossbow echoed to my right. The archer had fired at the werewolf. The arrow, though it did not pierce the beast, knocked it from its perch on the stone altar. Shaking off the disorientation, I scrambled to pick up my sword, which I had dropped in the tumult, and aligned myself with the other guards for the impending defense. The fall of their leader sent the sectarians into a frenzy. They charged at us with bestial screams, some clashing against our swords and arrows bare-handed, while others, overtaken by madness, dashed toward the swamps, becoming mired in the bog. As I shoved aside a gaunt man who was crazily trying to climb me or perhaps bite me, I felt a stir beneath my foot. I had stepped back for better stability when the earth beneath me shifted, and something clutched at my ankle. I whipped around, half expecting to find one of the frenzied cultists attacking from behind, but instead I saw the ground itself seem to churn and loosen, as if plowed by unseen forces. Sharp-tipped claws emerged from the newly turned soil, one already gripping my leg tightly. With a forceful jerk, I freed myself from the grasp and looked up to see a crowned head rising from the ground. It emerged as if breaching the surface of water, skilled and sinister, Time seemed to stand still for me. I became oblivious to the chaos around, the cries of the sectarians, the groans of my wounded comrades. My entire focus narrowed to the monstrous werewolf face, with its decaying fangs and deep, hauntingly red eyes. It wasn't a look of rage or reproach, but an invitation, a warm, tender voice in my head beckoning me to join it, to step beyond the agony of mortal existence and dissolve into an abyss of eternal decay. But I was not to be corrupted by this loathsome king werewolf. Another crossbow bolt flew, this time lodging between the beast's ribs. It staggered but did not fall. As its gaze dimmed, my own clarity returned, the warrior spirit within me reignited by the divine guardian force. The werewolf's abdomen pulsed as if filled with a writhing mass. It lunged, its hideous muzzle aimed at me, but I countered instinctively with a left-handed strike. No time for a sword swing. Beside me, Angus swung his blade, attempting to decapitate the creature, but his sword merely glanced off its thick hide. The werewolf's claws flashed toward Angus, grazing his abdomen and drawing blood with a shallow scratch. Yet my strike found its mark. With a silver sword, I severed the creature's head, which tumbled from its shoulders. Our fight lasted mere seconds, but it stretched into an eternity. Angus stood, speechless and panting heavily, as the cultists, suddenly devoid of their fervor, lowered their eyes and stood frozen. Our battle was over. Calls to Angus went unanswered until a firm slap brought him back to his senses. Quickly regaining his composure, he discarded his armor and knelt to wash in the swamp's scant waters. Nearby, the paladins rounded up the remaining fanatics, who offered no resistance to their capture. Some tried to speak, but in the moment, words seemed superfluous, and none of us were inclined to listen. I kept my distance, feeling as though the eerie, soft voice I'd heard was still lingering in my mind. But its source, the decapitated cult leader, lay lifeless and undoubtedly beyond reach. Angus managed to cleanse his face and hair of blood, visibly relieved to be the only one among us who had sustained injuries. Once we secured all the surviving cult adepts, binding them in a line, we set off to report back to Silverholm. The episode with the cult had come to an end, and the threat to city had been eliminated. The paladins led the chain of subdued and demoralized sectarians, with the hunters guiding us along a safe path through the forest. I brought up the rear, still uneasy about the cultists ahead who had surrendered too quickly after their leader's death, given their earlier ferocity. I yearned to leave the forest and tend to our wounds. As we brought our prisoners into Silverholm, the townspeople reacted with a mix of horror and astonishment. Among the disheveled and wild faces, they recognized former pillars of the community who had vanished after the town stopped being a fiefdom of the local aristocracy. There were knights from the Royal Legion, a successful merchant who had owned a fabric store before losing his business to a competing guild from Rivendell, and a revered pastor who had once tended the local cathedral. Even Baron Maine and his family, whom authorities had failed to locate previously, were found among the captives, along with other residents who had disappeared years before. The group also included children of these unions, showing signs of degeneration from incest, barely recognizable as human. Local gossip soon turned to spirits of the swamp, which they believed had consumed the sanity of these once respected citizens when guild power replaced aristocratic rule. We paid little attention to such rumors. It was clear to us that the disenfranchised servants of the old aristocracy had found a new ruler in the vile werewolf, a creature that had tried to ensnare their minds as it had almost done with mine. After handing over the prisoners to the city guard, we were free to resume our duties in peace. The paladin contingent returned to Rivendell. and life in Silverholm slowly returned to normal. Hunters and fishermen, however, remained cautious when venturing beyond the city limits. In the days that followed, I noticed changes in Angus. He became more withdrawn, often wandering alone on the outskirts of Silverholm, close to the forest. Frequently, I caught him staring intently towards the woods from his window as if expecting someone or something. Moreover, he often complained of feeling unwell, though no physical symptoms were evident. Whenever I tried to discuss his recent changes, Angus merely responded that he was exhausted by his service and was considering abandoning it. This was completely unlike him. We had weathered the entire war together, his commitment to maintaining order unwavering. Yet now he was ready to forsake his duties abruptly. I was deeply concerned about my friend's behavior, suspecting that the swamp incident, or perhaps the cult's actions, had deeply affected him. Even though the echoes of war had long faded, witnessing such brutality in peacetime was undeniably harrowing. One night, Angus's screams jolted us awake. He thrashed under his blanket as if in the grip of convulsions, shouting loudly. We restrained him, trying to soothe him, and even had to strike him a few times, but he continued to scream and scratch at himself, pleading with us to peel off his skin because he felt as if insects and larvae were crawling beneath it. Eventually, we calmed him down. He dismissed his outburst as a nightmare, seemingly unaware that he had awakened. The rest of the night was silent, but sleep eluded everyone. I watched over Angus, who remained motionless all night. During his solitary patrols on the city's outskirts or while resting, I began to observe him discreetly. He continued to act oddly, often gazing towards the forest and especially the swamp where the ordeal had occurred. I became particularly concerned when I saw Angus sitting by the city's edge, staring intently at a fallen spruce trunk covered with white mushrooms. He examined it with an unyielding gaze. Ashamed of spying on my friend, I approached him to talk. As soon as he heard my footsteps, he quickly got up as if awakening from a deep slumber. His responses to my questions were terse, and he declined to discuss his peculiar behavior. After a brief exchange, he insisted he needed to continue his patrol and walked away. Over time, Angus's condition deteriorated. He appeared lethargic and listless in the mornings, as if he hadn't slept at all. At night, he was restless, often waking up and disturbing others with his murmured conversations with the darkness. On one such occasion, he claimed he was wandering through a dark, malodorous forest, lost in impenetrable darkness. He described hearing a distant, deep, alluring voice that echoed in his mind like a parasitic whisper, inviting him to merge with it. The darkness then seemed to recede, revealing a vague, mist-enshrouded entity, a massive, pulsating, writhing shape, reminiscent of a gigantic worm in its slime, from which the voice emanated. I knew the voice he described. I had heard it too when that horrific werewolf tried to hypnotize me. It seemed the swamp and the cult had left a lasting scar on Angus, skewing his reality. That day, I chose not to press him further, but I planned to resume my inquiries. I also considered informing our superiors that Angus might no longer be fit for duty due to his mental state. The following day, I was on patrol and didn't see Angus. I returned to our quarters after sunset. The room was dark, but by the light of a lantern in the corridor, I could see Angus asleep on his cot. Opting not to wake him, I lay down in my own bed, clothed and weary, and quickly fell into a troubled sleep. My memory of what happened next is vague, and I am grateful for that. I was awakened by Angus's loud cry, but by the time I rose, he had quieted down and was sitting on his bed, staring fixedly out the window at the forest, bathed in moonlight. Behind Angus, in the shadowy corner of the room, I noticed something stirring. The darkness there was so dense that it seemed almost tangible, viscous. It shifted, twisted, and pulsed, gradually forming the vague outlines of a long creature, reminiscent of a worm or a centipede. From it, black tentacles pulsated outwards, enveloping Angus in their grasp. As he turned his head away from the window to face me, the dim moonlight revealed disturbing, writhing stripes across his face, marking a torment he seemed unable to escape. His lips quivered as he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. I finally understand them. Their prayers were true, and I willingly accept his will into my heart. You couldn't grasp what he was telling you. You rejected your existence within infinity. But I feel his presence. The power of the great king is here. Decay pervades everything. I hear him. Every death resonates within him. The werewolf king is here, coursing through my veins, and I see through his eyes. The darkness behind him then lit up with bright blue stripes of light that pulsed and twisted. This eerie light seemed to seep under Angus's skin, causing it to glow dimly from within. His face distorted. His skin stretched tight as large fangs erupted from his mouth, dripping with a foul-smelling black substance that oozed out in gurgles, forming the word master. The air filled with a putrid odor, as if an ancient tomb had been cracked open. The overwhelming smell seemed to penetrate deep into my mind, making it nearly unbearable to remain in the room. Despite wanting to flee, I found myself rooted to the spot, unable to move. All I could do was watch as Angus's face contorted further, his skin peeling back to reveal two glowing red eyes that stared at me with cold indifference. They were the same terrifying eyes of the werewolf that had led the dreadful cult. The last clear memory I have from that night is Angus slowly rising from the bed, his movements shaky as if he were a puppet. In a sudden burst of energy, he lunged at me. I instinctively raised my hand to protect myself, and his stinking, filthy fangs clamped down. I felt no pain, just a sickening sensation, and the sounds of my flesh tearing and bones crushing. It seemed to last an eternity, and then darkness claimed me. The old man's hand trembled as he finished recounting his story, a heavy sigh escaping his lips. It was evident that reliving these events was not easy for him. Alfred noted down Werner's last words carefully. "And you never saw Angus again?" Alfred asked gently. The storyteller flinched, momentarily caught off guard as if he had forgotten there was another person with him. "No, I never did. I woke up later in the infirmary. They told me I was found alone, unconscious, and missing an arm. Only a gnawed piece of bone remained." He rubbed his temple, his face contorting with a mix of anger and despair. Without an arm, there was no place for me in the city guard. I tried to stay in Silverholm, but the pity from the locals only drove me mad. I couldn't bear being a burden, and I often felt an eerie pull towards the forest, as if someone was calling me from among the trees. To preserve my sanity, I fled from there and have since lived here, secluded among the hills, away from everyone. Werner sighed deeply once more. "Years have passed since then, and now I'm old, my life nearly spent," he murmured, his voice a mere whisper. "Ah, I'm feeling the weight of my years, and this fine mead hasn't helped. I fear I can't offer you more. Thank you for listening. I hope my tale aids your writing." "It will certainly enrich my book," Alfred replied as he closed his notebook, sensing the finality in the old man's tone. "It's time for you to depart. You might still find an inn with a room available, and perhaps they'll have some dinner left," Werner added, his smile turning into a grimace that didn't quite reach his eyes. Alfred, taken aback by the sudden shift in the old soldier's demeanor, managed a polite smile and assisted Werner to his cot. "All the best to you, Mr. Werner," he said, receiving only a weak wave in response. The travelers left Werner's humble dwelling as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of crimson. Alfred, feeling a mild buzz from the mead, climbed into the carriage, thumbing through his notes filled with the eerie and unsettling narrative. Kara, slightly inebriated, followed suit with a heavy step. "Mr. Alfred, you surely don't plan to base a book on this madness? The old man has clearly lost his grip, solitude eating away at his sense," Kara remarked, skepticism coloring his tone. Alfred chuckled, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. "You think he's gone mad? Perhaps that's true. But I'll keep these notes. They might prove useful." Kara nudged the horses into motion, and they began their journey back. "Take us to the inn, enough for today. I need to rest," Alfred instructed. "As you wish," Kara responded, guiding the carriage along the darkening path. Wrapped in his travel cloak, Alfred wasn't cold but desired to shield himself from the day's haunting revelations. He reopened his notebook to the page detailing the gruesome ritual in the swamp. Though the story was terrifying, reminiscent of dark ancient cults that once thrived, the phrase "Werewolf King" particularly resonated with him. Alfred recalled a note about similar mad cults in other villages where this entity was revered as a deity of decay and death, rumored to demand infant sacrifices in twisted ceremonies mocking new life. Shaking off these morbid thoughts, he skimmed the lines again. Werner's vivid description of the cult's degenerate festivities invaded his mind, the blasphemous cries echoing in his thoughts. "King! Werewolf King!" Alfred pulled his gaze from the page to the open plains, where the sunset blazed like a fire across the sky, and a distant dust cloud rose as if from a galloping herd. But then, unsettling sounds reached his ears, tightening his chest with dread. A group of figures approached, their chants carrying across the wind. "King! Corpse King! Werewolf King! Lord of Death! He is with us." Alfred's eyes widened as he recognized the fanatics. They were residents from the village of Oak Ridge, confidently marching toward them, their chants growing louder.